Hello, I'm Caleb, part of the Narrate team. This week is part 3 of our Christmas series called Honest Gabe. This week, Adam looks at the vulnerability of God at the time of Jesus' birth.
So this morning there's this idea that I want to explore, and it's something that I've been working on for months and months on a personal level, and it's something that quite literally I can't think of a topic that I've spent more time trying to unpack in order to create a series and only leaving my time, hours and hours and a couple days in one case, and I just can't figure out how to make it a series. And I think the reason why is because on this topic, I am like that travel agent. Ever heard this? Like travel agent, like that's only pointing to places that I've never been. It's kind of where I'm at on this subject. I find it to be incredibly fascinating. It's been quite transformative for me, and yet I can't quite articulate it in a way that's perfectly clear and accessible. All that to say, I'm afraid of failure this morning. Hi, my name's Adam, and I'm afraid of failure. But in all honesty, like there's this idea that I would like to explore this morning. I think it can be pretty dramatic in the way it impacts us and the way we engage relationally and the way we engage our craft, whatever that is, and the way we create and the way we strive to accomplish things and fulfill dreams and all those different things. And so really my goal this morning, the win for me is twofold. The first part I'll tell you now, the second part I'll tell you at the end, but is just to inspire you into a stream of thought and really to become the student of something that maybe you never had before, and I think if you were to put some work into it, it could be a game changer for you. And I know that sounds like preacher talk, but I'm not a preacher, so you just have to take my word at it. The idea that I would like to explore this morning is this, that if we're looking to God for cues on how to live, then vulnerability isn't optional. What I mean by that is, like, if we go to the text and we ask questions about this God and what he's like and the way that he aspires to lead us, the way he himself leads, the way he relates to others, when we ask those questions, I'm just blown away more and more and more by the fact that this God is vulnerable to an extent that it almost defies the theological trappings that we put on him. You know, because we say things like all-powerful and all-knowing, and I certainly believe that, and yet in some cases like that almost grates against this notion of a God who, in some sense, is vulnerable. And so this morning, I just that's what I mean, like I can only tease the topic. I wish I was a psychologist. I wish I had studied psychiatry. I wish I was a theologian. I wish I was something other than Adam Hushka, because I think I might be able to articulate this more clearly, but all I can do is give you my Boy Scout best. So vulnerability is where we're going. A couple weeks ago, about a month ago, let me go back even further than that. About a year and a half ago, my friend Steve and I started home brewing at the same time. If that offends you, don't be offended. It's terrible anyway. You wouldn't like it, and so just give us our pathetic hobby. But so that creates these fun conversations between he and I, just like it is the case anytime you can relate to somebody, and we're both kind of sharing our horror stories of things like poor attenuation and these nerdy words that we just feel smart. And so he texted me about a month ago and said, "Hey, Adam, would you want all my empty bottles?" Now, I knew that the context of that was he was kegging now, and so, like, taking the labels off of bottles, that's a pain in the butt. Buying bottles, it's not expensive, but it's kind of like it's like buying dirt. You just don't feel like you should have to buy bottles because we throw them away all the time. I don't. You do when you drink beer. So anyway, so he said, like, would you like my bottles? And I said, yes, I'd love to have your bottles. And so the following Sunday, I got back to the Suburban, and he and my wife had already interacted. And I opened up the Suburban, and I don't know what the back of your van or car or Suburban looks like, but I've got 3 little boys and a wife, and so mine looks like what you might suspect. It's just messy. And so I opened up the back hatch of the Suburban, and there were 6 cases of beer bottles in the back. And they were kind of disheveled because, the back's messy, and so they were kind of propped around. And the other thing is like, if you're not German and cheap like my friend Steve and I don't know what nationality he is, but people who have some pride in their brewing, like they just buy blank bottles. The rest of us, like, we scrape labels off and stuff like that. And so his weren't, if you buy bottles, they're in a plain brown box. But if you don't, then they come in like the New Belgian or the Corona or the Dos Equis box that you bought them in at Costco. And so I think it was 5 of the 6 of them, they were labeled boxes like Corona and Dos Equis. And so I opened up the back of the Suburban and just like beer. And my wife actually had some funny interactions with some of you all because someone saw her like carrying these 3 cases and then 3 cases of beer after church to the back of the Suburban. So get that picture in your mind. Fast forward then to the next Monday, my wife and I had the day off, and we decided to go to Costco, and this was when it was like 300 below. So we went into Costco, And you know when you see somebody in Costco, but you don't want to see anybody you know in Costco to begin with, right? Like there's that, Caleb just wears his hood when he goes to Safeway. You could try that. But I saw someone and you know when you see him, but you can't place him, and then squirrel, and you kind of forget all about that whole thing. You know that deal? So that's what happened to me. Didn't think about it again, just thought about Brussels sprouts and things like that. And then we were pushing the cart to the Suburban afterwards. And as we were coming up on the car, parked behind the Suburban, directly behind the Suburban, I saw this man that I'd seen earlier in his car, and I immediately placed him. Not only did I place him, but I immediately, you know how your brain works faster than your mouth? My goal in life is to catch those two things so that they run parallel to each other. And immediately I went, oh yeah, I know who that is. And I got to be careful here, but he's a pastor in town, and he and I have shared some experiences together, and we're cordial, but it's pretty clear that we don't see things the same way, and that he would think that we're crazy. And so that's kind of the context, kind of that insecure, he doesn't like me anyway. And all that went through my head without thinking, and I opened up the back hatch of the Suburban. And he was parked directly behind me. So I'm standing there realizing that this guy who already thinks I don't know Jesus maybe is looking into the back of my Suburban, and it looks like I just cleaned up after a college frat party. So I just stood there with my back to the Suburban. I started telling Teresa, hey, this is what's going on. And we both kind of nervously laughed. And she said, well, I guess it's good that we're not caught up in managing our reputations. And then I was walking back to the car, and if that wasn't enough, it wasn't until I was opening my car door that I realized that when we finished, she took the cart and took it to the cart rack. And so I was getting in the car, and he was watching her now run through the parking lot. So if I didn't look like a jerk, I certainly did after all that. See, that kind of taps into the emotion of vulnerability, doesn't it? That feeling of being exposed, that feeling of feeling like you just gave someone too much information, that feeling like someone could misunderstand it and do whatever they want. Vulnerability is terrible, isn't it? And part of what I want to challenge you to reconcile this morning is that vulnerability is it's an emotion that we typically disdain. But what I want to suggest this morning is that the alternative is worse. And we'll talk more about that. Because see, to wake up, to be vulnerable is to wake up in the morning and choose to love someone who may or may not love you till the day you die. To be vulnerable is to commit to someone with no guarantees that they're going to stay committed to you. No guarantees that you're going to get not going to get that phone call. To be vulnerable as a parent is to tuck your kid into bed or send them off to college or walk them down the aisle and have everything in you disdain the feeling of handing them over and giving control of them over, and the emotion that comes with, if something happened to them, I don't know how I would get out of bed in the morning. To be vulnerable is to embrace all of that and not become controlling, but to just know it comes with life. To be vulnerable is to create. Whether you create paintings or you create music or you create reports or you create meals, whatever it is you create, to be vulnerable is to create, knowing full well that lots of people who are on the receiving end of your creation won't like it. They'll tell you so, and it'll feel really terrible. It's to write, it's to publish, it's to produce, it's to say, it's to present, knowing that there's somebody else in another part of the company or another part of the world that's better at it than you do, and everybody who just listened to it knows that they're better at it than you do, and you feel really pathetic. Vulnerable is terrible, it's scary, it's uncomfortable, but here's ultimately what I'd like to do this morning is if I could convince you that the God of the universe is vulnerable, would that have some persuasive power in convincing you that that's the way you're wired? If I could convince you that the all-knowing, all-powerful God of the universe lives himself from a place of vulnerability, then no matter where you're at in your spiritual bent, would it challenge you to think about that? And here's where Christmas comes in. Because I think that the God of the universe born a 5 or 6 or 7 pound newborn baby, and the threats of meconium and all the threats that come with being a newborn baby, all of it. I think that is insane. A God who wants and desires, a God who is in control, a God who it is his world. For him to enter a baby, I think it might just help us to step back from that and appreciate how vulnerable he was. And so really to ask that question, let's start in Luke 2, because really what I want to do, a few years ago, it hasn't been a few, it's been more like almost 10 now. I'm getting old. I spent a few years of my life really studying the Jewish context of Jesus' life, and there were some great guys like Ray Vanderland and Rob Bell's one of his students, and another guy named George DeYoung, who I got to go to Israel with along with some of you, and another guy named Marty, who I got to study with over there. And what I want to do is step into the Jewish context of Jesus' life, hopefully tell a story, and then leave you with some questions. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. See, let's start with this question. What was the world like at the time of Jesus' birth? And when you ask that question, what you run into is guys like Caesar Augustus. In fact, the answer becomes the world, specifically the European, Middle Eastern world that Jesus was born into, that his life was centralized around, that the Bible occurred in, it was ruled by the Roman Empire. And the question might be, how exactly did the Roman Empire conquer the world? Now, come with me, because I would like to point out a few just instances. What we're going to do is look at some snapshots of some rulers, 50 years of either side of Jesus' life, and just ask the question, what was the world like at the time of Jesus? Let's start with a guy named Germanicus. You might be able to imagine what part of the world he conquered. Said of his reign was this: he slaughtered the population across the Rhine. For 50 miles around, he wasted the country with sword and flame. Neither age nor sex inspired pity. Only the destruction of the race would end the war. So how did Rome conquer the world? Well, Germanicus tells us that they just went in and just committed full-on genocide. Pompey conquered the East in 64. There's an inscription on a temple in Rome today that declares that when he conquered the East, he enslaved 12 million people from 1,500 communities. Now, Caesar was called the Prince of Peace. How did he accomplish peace? Well, you're getting a sense. Well, one guy said this: they made the boundaries of the empire equal to the boundaries of the earth. In other words, they wanted it all. Titus conquered Judea. Now, I don't know why exactly this was the case, but the soldiers apparently were a little bored in Judea when they conquered the East, and so part of the way they amused themselves, because history says they were killing 500 men, women, or children a day when they conquered Judea. But the disdain between the Romans and the Jews was already at such fever pitch that part of what they did to keep themselves entertained, part of what came out of the overflow of their disgust and their resentment, was they would experiment with different ways to crucify people, like different positions to nail them in. One historian said this, and this, by the way, would have happened within a few miles of Nazareth, which was where Jesus was grown up. So Jesus would have grown up, and on the skyline, he would have seen this. Go ahead, next slide. So great was the number that space couldn't be found for the crosses, nor crosses for the bodies. So Jesus, he grew up and he watched these men who were so bored and so hateful that they would just experiment with the positions. Rome more or less had a competition to decide what was the most brutal form of execution that could be developed, and it was crucifixion that won, and so that became the state a means of capital punishment. Now, question then, who ran the Roman Empire? Well, of course, you know, if you've ever had a salad, that the Roman Empire was ruled by a series of Caesars. Got it yet? That's good, right? First of which was Julius Caesar. But because he was busy inventing the salad, Julius Caesar didn't actually unite the kingdom. He led a faction-driven kingdom. It wasn't until Caesar died, I believe it was in 44 BC, there was a civil war, and they were arguing who exactly is going to be in control. There was a civil war that broke out, and in 27 BC, a guy named Octavian, who was an adopted son of Julius Caesar, he was able to wrestle control of the remote from everybody else. He became the first Caesar who reigned supreme. The Roman Empire was 3,000 miles east to west. It took 9 months by their technology to get from one edge of the empire to the other. Octavian gained control of that in 24. He quickly adopted the name Caesar Augustus. That's the Caesar that shows up in Luke chapter 2. That's the Caesar that shows up in Jesus' life, the one that reigned through the majority, especially up through his adolescence. But where it gets interesting was in 17 BC, a strange star went across the night sky. And it was Octavian, or Caesar Augustus, who in watching that star made the declaration that wasn't just a star, but that was his father, Julius. And here's the way they said it. Here's the way, like, go to the library and read this, that it was his father, Julius, ascending to the right hand of the Father. or Zeus, ascending to the right hand of Zeus. Now, implications are enormous, because if Julius was God, what does that make Caesar Augustus? It makes him the son of God. And if Augustus is the son of God, then what is he entitled to? Anything he wants. The kind of puppet parliament that was in place agreed with him. They made declaration. They even kicked this off with an official state ceremony. They created this 12-day party. It was a party where people could bring gifts of worship to Caesar, where they could bring sacrifices for the forgiveness of sin. They literally said of Caesar Augustus that he was the Prince of Peace, the Savior of the world, the Lord. All those phrases that are familiar to you with Jesus were said of Caesar. This 12-day festival to celebrate Caesar Augustus as Lord, this is so crazy. Guess what it was called? Well, you can't. Yeah, it was called the 12 Days of Advent. So Caesar Augustus, he rises to a level of divinity. He makes it so that the only way that you can even do business and file your taxes in the kingdom is to declare that he is God. They call him Lord and Savior, Prince of Peace. But the question is, how did he accomplish peace? What was his style of ruling? How did he reign? You can see there's a tension that's setting up. Now the question, and I'm sure it's one that you've dealt with, is when you conquer the world, how do you go about controlling it? And this is what gets us to guys like Herod. Because what Rome would do was they would go back into these countries that they had conquered, and they would find disposed kings, former kings, and they would put them in positions of authority, but they were on a string. You know, like the deal was like, you scratch our backs, we'll scratch yours. You can live in luxury, but you got to do what we say. That's where Herod comes in. See, Herod was a regional ruler in this area. He was an influencer before he was a ruler. Herod, by the way, historians debate, but some really intelligent, thoughtful, studied people think that Herod was literally the wealthiest person to ever live, like ever. He had 50,000 personal attendants. Like his personal payroll had 50,000 people on it. Bill Gates has a paper route compared to that. 50,000 people. He was a decorated warrior. He was a gold medalist in the Olympics. At one point, when he was too old to compete, he single-handedly funded the Olympics. It was like him and Bob Costas. It was just their party. So Rome, they identified Herod. Now, the tension here is Herod was half Edomite, half Jewish. So the Jews hated him. They put him in power. One of the first things he did was besiege Jerusalem. Upon besieging Jerusalem, he massacred basically the entire city, or anybody who wasn't willing to be a sympathizer to the Roman government, which set itself up. And one of the narratives in the New Testament is Jerusalem is full of sympathizers to Rome. We'll get back to that a little bit this morning. That's why. He set up these monuments for worship all over the country. Now, like the Ten Commandments has as one of its central themes that you shouldn't have a graven image. Herod shows up, and he puts graven images everywhere. He insists upon the worship of Caesar. Part of his job is to keep the Caesar happy. And so he just constantly reinforces the need to worship Caesar. And he hated the Jews. And the Jews hated him. And part of the way that he communicated his authority was through his building. Let's start with a place called Masada. Masada is this place, I've been there. It's the hottest I've ever been in my entire life. We hiked up it one day. It was 11 o'clock in the morning. It was 117 degrees, and the sun was in our back. I knew I was in trouble when I passed Tyler Dean. It was bad. Legend had it that King David, when he was running from Saul, hid in the clefts of these rocks. Herod said, if he lived in poverty, I'll live in luxury. He built a 3-story palace. You can see the remains of that. The Dead Sea would be to the left in that picture. He built a 3-story palace. He imported marble columns from Rome. There was marble inlay all over the place. He had hot and cold baths, every bit the size of this room. They found dates recently, like food that had been stored there that was still edible. Power. Huge. The question is, if you build a palace in the middle of one of the driest, most stark deserts in the entire world, is how do you have drinking water? Herod dug a cistern. He didn't. He had his cronies dig a cistern. This is one of them. He recognized that in Jerusalem, 17 miles to the east, when it rained, water flowed east or west. When it flowed east, it flowed to the Jordan River, to the Galilee, to the Dead Sea. And so he literally rebuilt, we would call them drainages, they called them wadis. He literally rebuilt a couple of the drainages. and channeled that water to these cisterns. Archaeologists speculate that with one rainstorm, the Masada could support 10,000 people for 10 years. Power. He decided he wanted to build a port because Israel didn't have a port, and everybody needs a port. And he wanted a Greek port. He looked around and saw that the largest port in the world was 60 acres, so he said, I'll build one that's 520 acres. He named it, such a brown-noser, Caesarea. He drained the marshes. That's why there wasn't a port, because the land wasn't suitable for that. He drained it. You can see the remnants there. It was destroyed in the 70s. He poured concrete 80 feet below the ocean surface, 100 feet wide. This is 2,000 years ago. One day he went on a trip, and he decided when he returned that it wasn't beautiful enough as you entered it, and so he insisted that the entire port be lined with white marble, which it was. I've walked those beaches, and literally you pick up little shards of rounded, now it's rounded because it's been 2,000 years rolling around in the ocean. You pick up these little marble stones like you would pick up half of a seashell when you're walking the Puget Sound. It's everywhere. He says, we need a port. So let's just build ourselves a port. He had 11 wide. Oh, yeah, there's one other thing. There's an aqueduct there. The closest fresh water was, I think, 19 miles away. And so he decided to build an aqueduct, like above-ground aqueduct. To this day, engineers study it because it covered 19 miles. And with every meter it goes down exactly 1 centimeter. Perfect engineering 2,000 years ago. He had 11 wives and 43 children. It's a busy man. One time he went off on a trip and he suspected that one of his wives wanted to overthrow him. And so he said to an assistant, hey, if I die, kill her. His assistant told his wife that he had said that. And so when he returned, she was a bit distant. So he killed her. Another occasion, he found out a couple of his sons were working on his overthrow, and he found out about that. You can go to the library and read the speech that they gave. He called them into his chambers, so to speak, and had them killed in front of him. On another occasion, he recognized that if he were to die, nobody would mourn, that there would be a party, and that bothered him, that people would celebrate his death, even his own household. And then he got sick. He actually died, don't quote me on this, but I'm all but certain he died of syphilis. He rotted when he died. He was very sexually unhealthy and all these different things. But at one point, it looked like he was going to die. And so he had his officials round up all these important Jewish men, and he brought them to Jericho, which was more or less a resort city. He had them rounded up into the Hippodrome, that's like Mile High Stadium. And then once they got there, he barred the doors. And he told his sons that if he died, to kill everybody in the Hippodrome, because there was going to be mourning on his death. He actually lived through it. And after he lived, he found out that one of his sons didn't intend to follow through with his orders. And so he took his son and literally stuck his head in a vice and closed it slowly until his son was dead. Are you getting a feel for what the world was like? He also decided that he wanted to build the Temple Mount a little bit bigger. Go ahead. Can you find it in the midst of Jerusalem? That's not David's temple. That's Herod's temple. He made it massive. And of course, today when we build a house, we build retaining walls and foundation walls. They didn't have that, and so they had to build stones. And so on that outside, that exterior, that would be the Temple Mount, because that's actually a mountain that they had to then backfill all this dirt into. He brought in these stones. It was 18,000 people that he employed to build the Temple Mount. He brought in these stones that are 10 by 10 by 80 feet in size. They weigh hundreds of tons. They say that the only thing that would come close to being able to move one of those today is a crane that we would move a cruise ship with, but that wouldn't move it into a city. And the Jewish historian Josephus tells us that at the time of the building of Herod's temple, not the sound of a chisel could be heard, which means he moved tens of thousands of these Herodian stones, they're called, into Jerusalem. And we don't even know how we would do it today. He was also paranoid. Can you tell why? And part of his strategy was that should he have to retreat from danger, he would have a series of palaces to retreat to. So he had Masada, and he had one in Edom, but he needed one in between. And so he drew a line, and literally that line, the spot landed at a place that was completely flat. But he said, we got to put a palace there, and I like my palace on the tops of mountains because they're easier to defend. I learned that in Capture the Flag. And so he had this thing called the Herodian built. That's the Herodian. What's hard to appreciate, you can go Google this, is everything around there. Bethlehem would be just to the right of this picture. It's like the Herodian is to Bethlehem what Mount Helena is to Helena. That's not a natural mountain. That's a man-made mountain. You can actually see it from the Mount of Olives. You can also see the Dead Sea. One time Jesus was standing on the Mount of Olives with his guys, and he said, hey, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, like you could say to that mountain, be gone and cast into the sea, and it would be gone. We have every reason to think he was staring at the Herodian and was speaking directly to what the Herodian represented. There's a pool in the top of the Herodian, because you need a pool if you're going to have a palace. And in the middle of the pool was a gazebo, and they said that the pool was so large that they used boats to access the gazebo. Getting a sense for how Herod played his game. Now, having done that, let's look at a few passages in Matthew and see if this impacts the Christmas story. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who's been born king of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Question, why would he have been disturbed? Do you start to get the feel for what Matthew's saying here? Like everything about Jesus is a threat. Why would all of Jerusalem been disturbed? Because Jerusalem, like those are the haves. Those are the people who agree. Those are the people who have agreed not to like mess with the apple cart, so to speak, because they have luxury because of it. And in fact, some point out that around Jerusalem there were no farmlands. What that means is that the taxed people, the people who were paying 60, 70, 80% of their income to Rome, they weren't anywhere near Jerusalem. Thus, they had no reason to hate Rome. Why were they disturbed? Well, because Jesus was threatening their very way of life. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. Where's Bethlehem? It's in the shadow of the Herodian. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. Watch this. As soon as you find him, report to me, so I too may go and worship him. Like, yeah, I was born in a barn, Herod. You have to wonder if some of his assistants were going like, no, like bullshit. He's not going to worship the Messiah. Like, it's not going to happen. Sorry, probably shouldn't have said that. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and iPad. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Now, how was Caesar Augustus declared to be divine? By a star rising in the east. What was at stake here for Jesus? Well, you might say everything. See, what Matthew's doing here is he's going, who's your king? Is Herod your king? Is Caesar your king? Like, is that how you accomplish peace? By genocide? Is that how you accomplish power? By just destroying whole nations? Like, who is your king? You can see now why the New Testament celebrates Jesus as Lord and Savior in this completely different way. But here's my point. Do you see how dangerous Christmas was? Like, just suspend for just a few more minutes. Your understanding of God is all-powerful and all-knowing. I believe that too. But do you see how dangerous this was? Like, if you're God, do you send your son to poor parents born in questionable circumstances? Or do you send him with ripped abs and big biceps and the prince of a very powerful kingdom? Like, if you're God, do you want the Savior of the world, the hope of the world, born in the shadows of the Herodian? Or do you want him behind several layers of wall with big cannons and lots of horses and chariots between you and them? See, I would argue that something about God just consistently goes the way of risk. It consistently goes the way of unsafe. It consistently goes the way of uncontrolled. It consistently goes the way of vulnerability. Like, just step back from Christmas and look again at the garden. Like, God creates. And theologians will tell us that it is essential that we understand that God did not create out of need. He wasn't lonely. He didn't need anything. He created because he could. He created out of love and joy. He had the oneness of the Trinity going on. He didn't need us, but he made us. Let me ask you this. Did he program it in such a way that we had no choice but to receive what he had to offer? I mean, I don't know, I'm a man. I like to know that there's a guarantee. Like if I'm God and I'm gonna create people, I'm gonna wire it in such a way that the thing can't go south. Does he? No, he actually leaves room to be left. He actually leaves room to be betrayed. He actually leaves room to throw open the back hatch of the Suburban and have someone see something that's really uncomfortable. Constantly. And when we finally rebel, because essentially what we say to God is, you're not good enough. Does he pout? Does he stomp us out like an ant? All of things which he could have done. Part of what I love about the first few chapters of the Bible is the vulnerability of God, because you catch God saying things like, maybe I'll destroy them. Maybe I'll start over. And it's Noah that leads him to the answer to no leads to Noah. So we spit in his face. Listen, you've been married, some of you. You've had friends. You've been betrayed. How many times are you willing to? And I understand there's this thing called boundaries we have to hold in tension. But then God just keeps pursuing. Keeps pursuing. Keeps pursuing. And the whole Old Testament is a God who says, I would love to bless you. Okay, we'll take it for a while. Nah, I think we got it better without you. And you just read Judges, and it's this cycle. What is it? It's us. It's a people who in one sense receive God's love and the next reject it. Which gets us to Christmas, where God comes to rescue us, not with a giant spaceship, not with a mighty warrior, not even with a military commander. He comes with an infant, threatened in every way. He says, follow me. And we go, okay, maybe. Like, see, I want to suggest to you that God is so vulnerable. He constantly goes the way of risk, which leads me to this question. And I know it's a leap, and this is where I said this isn't a complete thought. But if that's God's posture towards vulnerability, then what do you suppose he asks of us? If God approaches life from a position of vulnerability, then how do you think he calls us to approach life? If God looks risk in the face and doesn't retreat from it, and doesn't guarantee that failure can't happen, but steps into it, what do you suppose he calls you to do in your business, in your relationships, in your work, in your art? If God is willing to create something and go, man, I think this is so great, and have other people go, that's terrible, how do you suppose he calls you to? Like, if God is willing to engage in relationships and fall so in love with people, be so enamored by them, and then allow them to rip his heart out, how do you suppose he calls you to exist in marriage as a parent? This is where I start hitting walls, because I've had so much fun wrestling with this stuff, and there's been some real honest transformation that's occurred, and I can't quite diagram it. What I can tell you is what it looks like for me. What it looks like for me as a husband is the realization that there's nothing I can do to guarantee that I get to walk with Teresa for the rest of my life. And that my natural response when I identify vulnerability is to control. But that's not the way God rolls. God loves. He loves us in such a way where he says, you'd be crazy to not want to be with me. But he doesn't control. He doesn't demand. He doesn't insist. As a parent, God, for where it's transferred for me, is as I tuck the boys in and you have those unimaginable like daydreams of like, I can't handle something bad happening to you. And so therefore what? I'll just make it my job as a parent to keep you safe, which has never been in the job description of a parent. It's to teach them how to live, yes. But to guarantee that nothing bad happens, that's not parenting. At least my understanding of it, especially if my understanding comes from God. In my work, I have mine, you have yours. What it's taught me is that come Thursday at 11:30 and I realize I don't have any more time to write any new material for a sermon, and it's not nearly as good as it should be and you deserve and lots of other people are delivering in other places, I just have to go I just got to step into this. I got to ship. I can only work hard for so long, but at some point you just got to go. You just got to put it out there. And yeah, some people are going to go, I didn't like it, and some people are going to go, man, that sounded like you didn't give it any thought, and lots and lots and lots of different things. But it just means you put it out there. See, Brene Brown, who is this brilliant researcher and Christ follower, she spent her first 25 years of her career, she's a sociologist by training, she kind of haphazardly walked walked into studying shame. For 25 years, she studied shame. And if you ask the question, a friend asked me this between services, why vulnerability? She would say this. She would say, because the alternative to vulnerability is shame. That you can't not feel one of the two. You either feel shame, you feel self-hatred, you feel like pathetic, or you feel vulnerable. And you know that you're less than perfect. And you know you're probably not the best the company has to offer. And you know you're not whatever. But you don't retreat from it. See, the difference between vulnerability and shame is vulnerability steps forward. Shame steps backward. She would say you only can have one or the other. She would also say that you can only feel either secure or courageous. Never both. Not an option. You pick. And I would say that if your faith is the organizing principle of your life, and even if it's not, you wouldn't be here if you weren't intrigued by the notion of that. If your faith is the organizing principle of your life, then courage is the only option you have. God has never called you to be safe. He's never called you to die old. He's never called you to pursue security. He's always called you to live courageously. Go back and be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous. Jesus' most repeated command was fear not. It's a call to courage. Something we'll explore a little bit more on Christmas Eve, and I can't wait for that. It's kind of a part 2 of all this. But you have a choice. You can be secure, or you can be courageous. See, here's ultimately where the challenge, one more thing, the most applicable thing for me on this, Brene talks about these things called permission slips. Too bad Von Miller's been ruled out for today's game. That's distracting. But she... no idea. She talks about these things called permission slips. What are we talking about? I don't know. And permission slips are things that when she identifies a sense of vulnerability, she just writes herself a permission slip. I've been working on it. I did one in preparation for this weekend. I have permission to not be clear enough, to not be engaging enough, to not be cool enough, and to be less than theologically perfect. She says vulnerability writes their permission slips and steps forward. Shame sees the threat of the need for permission and goes and finds something else to do. So my challenge for you, and this is so unreconciled, but my challenge to you this morning, I think that one of the healthiest things you could do in the next few weeks would be to grab her material. She has the most listened to TED Talk ever. You can find her online. Her book, Daring Greatly, is without a doubt the best book I've read in 2013. And no, we're not making a commission. In fact, if you buy one for $13, we lose a little bit of money because we wanted an even number. It's the only book I've read in recent memory where I finished it and immediately read it again. And then after I finished that, I dedicated 3 or 4 weeks of my quiet times to it. It's that gripping. That's part 1. I think as a parent, as a spouse, as an employee, vulnerability may unlock some pretty sealed doors for you. And the second thing is this. I think this takes the lid off of Christmas. Because it's so easy to gather and sing these sometimes superficial songs and miss the full story of a God who was taking an incredible move in the direction of vulnerability. Like in being born up infant, for crying out loud. Have you ever seen one? They're pathetic. They cannot help themselves. That's the way God entered the world. For me, I think there's just a whole new level of worship that can open up.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.